Greetings and peace, everyone. I would like to start this talk tonight with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful. Tonight, this evening, we always have the honor and pleasure and privilege of being joined by our beloved Sheikh from the Fatimiyya Sufi order, Sheikh Wahid Azal, and he's joining us tonight for part 6 to talk about the Islamic origins of Western ceremonial magic, the Enochian systems, John Dee, and why Islam in the East is always not given credit, why it's always denied its actual credit in terms of all of these esoteric schools. And of course, our beloved Sheikh always speaks the truth. He always speaks from the heart. And that's why he always stirs up the nest of the agents of the chaos, which is a necessary truth and a deed that needs to be done by those that are on the side of good and justice. So without further ado, I give the greeting of Assalamu alaikum and Nur alaikum to our beloved Sheikh on tonight's topic.
Wa alaikum Nur to everybody, and thank you again for having me on. As always, it's an honor. This is a great topic, and it's a topic that needs to first be unpacked from kind of the base level. And that is that I tend to look at the fact that the Islamic world itself is not being given credit. Has to do with contemporary developments, because at an earlier time, the situation was actually quite different, where Europe particularly coveted anything that came from the Islamic world. Because up until probably the Renaissance, the Islamic world was effectively the developed world, and Europe was sort of the backwater, or the second world, not so much the backwater. The Renaissance and then the conquest of the Americas by the early forces of European colonialism changed the situation permanently. But we have to really look at the 19th century and the 20th century when we begin to see the emergence of these Islamist movements all throughout the Muslim world, whether in the subcontinent in the form of the Deobandis or in North Africa and much of the Middle East in the form of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, and so on and so forth, that basically as movements are rejectionist movements of everything that came before. And this is what a lot of Westerners don't understand about the contemporary Islamist and fundamentalist movements in the Muslim world, is that whether we talk about the Wahhabis, whether we talk about the Deobandis or the Muslim Brotherhood, that these are really modernist forces that are reactionary and reactive forces that first emerged in our part of the world as a result of European colonialism, but fundamentally as rejectionist movements of Islamic culture and Islamic civilization itself up to that point. Before all of this, the occult and occult knowledge and even scientific knowledge from the Islamic world was very actively coveted by Europeans. And so you have, from the period of the Abbasid Caliphate all the way, I would say, to the early years or the early centuries of the Ottoman Empire, knowledge was actually flowing from the East to Europe. And so you had translation projects spanning centuries between Baghdad and Rome, or North Africa and Rome, and so on and so forth. The modern world changes all of this. And so here we are, where we're living in a situation where most of the West looks at the Islamic world as backward and reactionary and superstitious and stupid and etc., where in previous century, the actual situation was the other way around. And where philosophy, the occult, mysticism is concerned, Europe looked at the Islamic world for many centuries with a lot of envy, even though they produced their own traditions of some amazing mystics and some amazing philosophers, names like Meister Eckhart and Marguerite Poré, John Scotus, Eriugena, you have all these amazing names that I take nothing away from. These figures are monuments in their own right. But on the subject of the occult itself, the European occult tradition, and particularly the tradition that we now know as the ceremonial magic tradition, that really begins in the present form that we have it today during the 19th century with the Golden Dawn, the works of Aleister Crowley, etc. Much of this has its textual genealogy in works that were circulating for a few centuries, and particularly from beginning in the Renaissance, that had their origins actually in Islamic texts. If, for example, one of the bases of the Western ceremonial magic tradition is what they call the Solomonic grimoire tradition. And the Solomonic grimoire tradition, for example, with central texts such as the book of Abramelin the Mage, this entire text is a pastiche that was cobbled together from various elements of text that already existed previous centuries within the Islamic world, particularly the text of Buni, whether we're talking about his Shams al-Ma'arif, the son of Gnosis, or texts like the Shamus al-Anwar, the sons of the lights, etc., and various massive productions of occult book production and whatnot in that part of the world. That during this period, especially during the Renaissance, when you have a massive translation project into Latin and Italian and German later as well, of Arabic, these texts find their way into Europe, but without their authors or without their sources being mentioned. Now, one of the central figures of the European occult tradition, a 16th century, late 15th century, early 16th century figure by the name of Henry Cornelius Agrippa. And he wrote the 5 books or the 4 books of occult philosophy. And when one delves into his book, he very occasionally name drops, and source drops about a lot of the origins of this stuff. Now, in the contemporary period, most people believe that the Solomonic grimoire tradition has its origins in esoteric Judaism and Kabbalah specifically. As I have gone on record on numerous occasions and also on your podcast, the origins of the Kabbalah itself occur within the Islamic world. So this layer of the ceremonial magical tradition of the West itself, because of even the origins of the Kabbalah, has to be located in the Islamic world. And particularly with texts such as Abramelin the Mage, the Book of Moses, the talismanic workings that are associated with the Book of Moses, this 6th Book of Moses, which is actually a pseudo-epigrapha or an apocryphal text, because Moses didn't write an occult text. But these texts all have their origins in the Islamic world. That particular book that I mentioned, the 6th Book of Moses, has very unequivocally its origins within a subchapter of the first book of Al-Buni's Shams al-Ma'arif, where you have a talisman and a working and a whole subsection of this book devoted to this talisman known as the Staff of Moses itself. And so you find these elements that being reinterpreted and recrafted and redacted and then rewritten again in these Solomonic sources in Europe that then emerge as various texts from about the 18th century onwards, but then get codified in various titles during the 19th century by the Golden Dawn and what have you. So this is only one example. The other example, which is very notable, and I've spoken to several people who actually research this area in the academy, is the system of John Dee, the system of Enochian magic. Anyone who has delved deeply into this system of John Dee will quickly figure out that a lot of the sigils, a lot of the callings, a lot of the hierarchy of the cosmology of this thing has very interesting resonances to the esoteric and occult hierarchy that Ahmed al-Buni himself delineates right at the beginning of his Shams al-Ma'arif al-Kubra. So the question is, what happened? Well, what happened is that we know for a fact that John Dee was a connoisseur of the occult in every conceivable form, and that he had a massive library at his disposal, and that within his library, there were a vast range of Arabic occult manuscripts and scientific manuscripts as well. So the question is, did John Dee read Arabic? We don't know that. This can never be proved. Nevertheless, because of trade and because of the back and forth flow between various people from various regions of North Africa to the Isles, and also John Dee's own travels throughout Europe and into Eastern Europe particularly, it is very conceivable that he had run across people who were quite conversant in these languages and translated many of these texts for him. Unfortunately, John Dee's library during the time that he was also with Edward Kelly burnt. So we don't know exactly what titles were in his library, but a substantial amount of this library, or a third of his library, did survive. And John Dee himself also has mentioned various texts that he had at his disposal during that time. So, a dissertation topic for somebody who wants to actually look at this area closely and do a research project on it is to delve into the system of Enochiana and Albuni and all of these various, beyond Albuni, this entire tradition of Arabic occult manuscripts that was being transmitted to Europe and through Eastern Europe, of which apparently the Vatican holds a massive holding of texts, even today, some of which they collected all the way back into the 13th century. And very quickly, when you do these comparisons, do the analysis, do the philology and the unpacking and the textual criticism, you cannot fail to come to the conclusion that much of this system of ceremonial magic that is popular in the West now has its origins in Islamic occult manuscripts. So this is where I come from this. Unfortunately, a lot of people, when they hear things like this, get kind of anxious or perturbed or aggressive because it kind of contradicts their view that the West has generated everything sui generis from nothing, ex nihilo, and but the fact is that cultures interact with each other and that cultures evolve, and especially on the level of the occult, people pick and choose and take from one another and then develop these elements according to their own understanding and the evolutionary locus of their own cultures at that time. So cultures are not static entities. Everything is interacting. Maybe today in the age of mass communication, we have easier access to this stuff, but people have been interacting with each other across cultures for millennia. So this is nothing new. And where the occult and esotericism and all of this is concerned, this was definitely going to case. And I think it's very important that this be acknowledged and that even, very seasoned Western ceremonial magicians pay their dues to the culture of the locus of a lot of these texts, just as we in the Islamic world pay our due to our forebears, such as the Jewish culture that was very much responsible for a lot of the elements that exist, especially the immediate systems of esotericism before the rise of Islam, such as Jewish Hekalat, that was very prevalent in the Middle East at that time. And also the various Greco-Hellenistic syncretic movements and ideas that were percolating in that area of the Middle East and Europe and North Africa for, not just the period preceding the rise of Islam, but also the period after the rise of Islam, to which the Islamic civilization itself tremendously benefited. So cultures are now islands, and even on the question of spirituality and the occult, one culture provides one particular lens as to how to perceive the spirit, another culture perceives another lens, and when these lenses come together, we have a much more clearer perspective of what it is that we're dealing with, because ultimately the spirit is universal and inhabits both all cultures and is beyond them simultaneously. And so I think it behooves us all, to acknowledge this fact and not shun it and run away with it. The Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, himself says, seek knowledge, even if it be as far as China, which implicitly acknowledges right off the bat that, that this borrowing and developing and syncretizing and mixing and matching and all of this is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But in these times that we're living in, that where a certain demon has been resurrected again, there's this, it was never dead. It's always been around, but it's in its very aggressive form, it has been resurrected. This whole white supremacy, you have a lot of people who claim to be Gnostics or claim to be, some form of esotericists that are buying into this extremely dubious, racialized narrative of spirituality that always ends up at the same place. That was also the same dubious racialized narrative that was subscribed to by Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party of Germany and all of these fascists of yore, all of which unfortunately has its genesis in colonial narratives and colonial mentalities and supremacist narratives and what have you during the 19th century, during the height of European colonialism, where it needed to craft an ideology of its own supremacy to convince also primarily its own people, not so much the people that it was conquering, but primarily its own people that it was the best thing since sliced bread. But the truth of history, the truth of culture, the truth of the spirit is beyond all of these things. As the first verse of the Surah of Women, Surah An-Nisa says, God created humanity as a single soul, right? And then dispersed humanity into tribes and cultures in order to know each other, right? So even in that verse from the Quran itself, we are being told that as the single soul, even when in its multiplicity of diversions and whatnot, that ultimately the whole point of the exercise is for humanity to know each other, to interact with each other, to learn from each other. We can learn from the Chinese, we can learn from the Indians, we can learn from Iran, we can learn from the Europeans, we can learn from the Russians, we can learn from the native peoples. They all have a perspective on the spirit, that is just as valid and sometimes even beyond the perspectives that we have. They are Muslims in their own way, whether we're talking about the North American Indians and South American Indians or the native Aboriginal people of this land where I'm living right now, and so on and so forth. These are all very good things. Humanity, borrowing and learning from each other, people refining and the knowledge of not just the material reality that we're dealing with, but also the immaterial reality of the spirits itself. These are all great things. And this is what happened. And this is how Western ceremonial magic emerged in its seat from this very thing. So I look at this as a great thing. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Where it gets hairy is when one culture or another begins to assert their own domination or supremacy or superiority over another. We are a human collective. There is one God that created us as a single soul, and this is the collective experience of humanity. And we borrow from each other, and we trade with each other, and we love each other. Races have emerged from the joining of different races and different people into, this is all a good thing. This is the history of humanity. But unfortunately, like we know today in this time, there are forces, because they feel that postmodernism and the modern world has gone too far, and the mobility of people of color has become a threat to these people, on the level of spirituality and esotericism. They start to assert their supremacy and superiority, etc., trying to revive the very same toxic nonsense that was prevalent in the 1930s and 1940s in Europe, that led straight to the gas chambers of Treblinka and Auschwitz. And a lot of these people, inhabit the North American landscape, and they look at someone like, for example, Alexander Dugin as the best thing since sliced bread. As I've said before, Alexander Dugin is a Pied Piper of the Kremlin. I am ready and able at any time of his choosing and place to debate this man in public over his book, The Fourth Political Theory, and also some of his other writings whenever he wishes, because this man is not saying anything that is actually going to help humanity progress and get, and liberate itself from the clutches of both the lingering authoritarianisms of the past or the emerging authoritarianisms of technology, that if not checked, and if humanity does not put them in its place, is going to enslave us collectively worse than anything that we have ever experienced before. But these ideologies of race, of ethno-pluralism, using separatism and separation of humanity, using very fancy lingo, this stuff is not good. This is stuff that is backwards. It is not forwards. It is not the path of liberation of humans. It's the path of enslavement of humans. So, we got to be very mindful of the things that we deal with, and especially when we deal on the level of the occult, because the level of the occult is the level of the spirit.
Mm.
By any system that you approach the occult, you're basically approaching and entering the terrain of the spirit itself. And on that level, causality is much more magnetic than the usual causality that we're used to in the mundane. And so there's also responsibility involved on the people that practice this stuff to have both the integrity of approach and also the integrity of understanding about what they are approaching. Because if you don't, and you keep pushing these ethno-pluralist or Gnostic capital G narratives of the kind that certain of our friends are currently pushing online, what you are doing is creating turbulence in the waters, as it were. That ultimately always also come back and hurt the very people that are creating this turbulence. And this is what they don't understand. Unfortunately, this is the nature of the dark side, and the dark side is blind, usually, to even its own actions. And it acts upon impulse rather than understanding and the ability to see the bigger picture. And many of these folks that are online are also LARPers, in my opinion. They're not real practitioners, and they don't know very much of anything, despite their claims. And so what they're doing is that instead of being agents of healing, they are becoming agents of further, further aggravation and further unhealing, for lack of a better term. So we have to be careful. When I say things like this, for example, that the ceremonial magical tradition has its locus in Islamic Arabic and Islamic magical and occult texts, this is not as a way to be an affront to people who are practicing this particular discipline. It's to basically point out to them that these people owe some debt to that part of the world, that this system has a origin, has a seed, and that perhaps maybe it is to their benefit, to the benefit of their own practice, to look at this stuff, more intently.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, Sheikh, because I've noticed like a trend of a lot of the white supremacists here associating with the Norse mythology and the Vikings and Odin. And it's so interesting that they don't even know the history that the Vikings were dealing with Islamic people. They were dealing with Muslims. There were actually artifacts that were found with rings that had the name of God, Allah, written on the ring. And even in the Assassin's Creed video game, the new one, the newest one where you're playing as a Viking character, there is a group of Hashashin that are present in their village that are there helping the Vikings, and they're like learning from each other. So a lot of these video games are created by occultists who are sharing these truths in these games in terms of not just having an Islamic bias, but even if you look at the Masonic square and compass, and if you ask them what is the origin of that, they say it's lost in history. We don't know. But if you look at the history, even China. So I'm not just having a bias for Islam, but I give credit where it's due. If you look at the painting of Nuwa and Fuxi, the god, like the female and the male god that comes from one body, one is holding the square, the other is holding the compass, and they're recreating the world. And this is 2,000 years ago from the Han Dynasty. Even with the Sufi traditions, they don't give credit that the Templars had learned from the Sufis. They wear the wool on top of their hats. Where does that come from? It comes from Suf, wool, the purity. So it just goes to show you that there are many missing links that these people refuse to address. We're not here to hate anybody. We're here to basically push that aspect of the one ummah, that we're here to learn from each other, respect from each other, but also call out those who do not give others their due credit, their due human right, and they lower their humanity or their value in any way, shape, or form. That's the goal of myself and Sheikh Wahid Azal in terms of what we're doing. And it's very important that you listen to this, all of the talks that we did with an open mind, and do something about it in your own personal life to make this world a better place, because that's exactly what our goal is, against these agents of chaos and people that are hiding behind these different spiritual facades, but deep down inside, it's a totally different game. So please continue.
Yeah, that is the bottom line. The way you put it is the best way to put it. People who are hiding behind the facade of spirituality, but they have a completely different game. And despite his pretensions to traditionalism and Orthodox Christianity, Alexander Dugin epitomizes this in himself. Because when you read his works, and particularly his fourth political theory, this guy is a fascist. He's nothing else. He may call it something else. He might say that the age of liberalism and fascism and communism is over. We have to create something else. Sure, but the result and the proposal that he's putting out there is to create an ethno-pluralist world, which is a fancy way masquerading as white people in their own countries and black and brown people in their own countries, and complete division of humanity, which has never occurred at any point in human history. Have we ever had this kind of division? These sorts of divisions are actually, figments of modernism, the very modernism that Mr. Alexander Dugin claims to be against. Yes. Human cultures have interacted with each other for millennia, from the dawn of humanity, when the first seeds of humans, whether they came out of Africa, as some people believe, or where the native people here on this land believe that the first humans actually emerged here on Terra Australis, or wherever. We human beings are one soul, one ummah, one, under one God, one spirit, okay? And we are diverse because of our environmental factors of the places that we've lived, our languages, our cultures, whatnot. For those of them who are Christians, I would send them back to their own Bible to reflect on the story of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel as to why these diversities exist. Now, we don't take these stories literally, obviously, but within the story of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, there's a great parable, because humanity up to that point, when Mr. Nimrod, this king who wanted to vie with the Almighty himself, before he shoots that arrow into the sky from the top of his Tower of Babel, humanity could understand each other. But because of the arrogance of this king, right, who thought he could vie with the Almighty himself, right, as a punishment, the Lord of the universe made that the diversion where humans could no longer understand each other.
Yes.
Right? This is a parable. Now, this parable can be actually put together in such a way that the arrogance of humanities who think that they can vie with the plan of the Creator himself is always what produces the divisions, right? When you step back from that, it doesn't matter what culture that you come from. It doesn't matter what language you speak. Ultimately, you're human. Right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
And that humanity is beyond language, beyond ideology, right? On the level of science, there's a biological fact. So this whole deterministic Darwinism that was spawned in the 19th century that's now permutated and evolved into these very noxious ideologies of white supremacy, under the glare of science itself, under the glare of the microscope of science, they fall apart. There is no difference between the biologies and the determinisms of the biologies of someone living in Manhattan, to someone living in Mumbai, to someone living in Beijing, in the North Pole, South Pole, here in Australia, etc. Even the various transitions in the evolution of humanity, from whether we're talking from Australopithecus to Homo erectus, and finally to Homo sapiens, etc., the science still is not completely satisfied that we are talking about diverse humans. And besides, we know for a fact that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were mating together. So that means that these were not different species. Just like humans and animals cannot produce a third entity in Mother Nature itself. I mean, perhaps cloning science is now trying to change all that, another Tower of Babel. But in a natural setting, two different species cannot produce an offspring. Yet the science is now proving that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were mating. And perhaps what preceded the Neanderthals were mating to become the Neanderthals, etc. So on the level of science itself, on the level of biological science, is proving that humanity is one soul, right? That the external forms of humans, the color of their skin, or how big or small their noses or their foreheads or ears, or whatever, these are all irrelevant.
Ultimately. Yeah. And it's so interesting you point this out, because even when the Moors were in Spain, And there was the aspect of the Alhambra, this basically this beautiful structure of education, arts. And I saw this meme that was circulating around that when those from the West would come and study in these universities, during their graduation, they would be dressed in Oriental clothing, like loose Oriental clothing. And now when you look at the graduation ceremonies in the Western world of graduating from school, college, university, etc., they still wear the like the thope-like clothes. So it's so interesting that that correlation is there, even though they don't point that out, which I want to give credit to a Masonic brother here in Pennsylvania who made a presentation called Being Lost in the Alhambra, where he described there's a room in the Grand Lodge here, which is basically like an Islamic mosques, the way that it looks. And he describes like different Islamic Masonic architecture throughout Pennsylvania with these different Masonic temples. So I want to give credit to him where it's due for that. But you're right. It's these different influences learning from each other, and everyone's has is sharing the truth in their own way. Like it says in Surah 2, verse 662, that as long as you believe in God, do the right thing, don't do anybody wrong, you're going to be absolutely fine. You look at the Hindu text, Krishna says, whatever path you follow, it all leads back to me. And that even invalidates the Hindu extremists and the Hindu supremacy that is hurting non-Hindus in India right now and whatever is going on all over the world. So people have to get deeper into their practice and learn their own truths and realize it's not the religious stuff that's wrong. It's you, the human, who has fallen astray from each other,
Exactly.
from yourselves, and from the element around you. So I would like to ask you the aspect that why with John Dee, Enochian magic, these different Western esoteric circles. I mean, even Crowley himself had went to Egypt and studied the Quran. And there was a Thelemite from his circle that reached out to me. And he said, we are taught to respect Islam and respect everything. So what is this connection that the average thinker and knower is not getting here?
Let me first address the thing that you did with Crowley. Crowley is interesting. Crowley had a really deep, abiding love for Islam. And when he was in the deserts of North Africa, that big working he did, the big Enochian working he did, he was actually reciting the Surah Al-Ikhlas like a couple hundred times a day. And that's when his vision opened about some of the stuff that he wrote. And in fact, it was preceding when the descent of the Book of the Law. So the Quran itself in Surah Al-Ikhlas, the 112th Surah of the Quran, was responsible for spawning the central text of Thelema, which is very interesting. And, Crowley gave his dues. He never concealed this or whatnot. What is happening today is because of this so-called clash of civilization.
Yes.
Which is a manufactured narrative that the Western elites, particularly, and now also bought into by these controlled elites of Russia and China, even
Yes.
have bought into, is that humanity is following different direction and we're at a war with each other culturally. I would beg to differ because the war is not on the level of culture. The war is really on the level of economics. It always has been. It has been about the control of resources. Culture is only very secondary to this because on the level of culture, we haven't had a clash of civilizations, right? Thinkers and whatnot, universities all throughout the West, they have always acknowledged, their depth to whether to the Muslim world or to the East in general, in China, India, etc., Japan. But since the post-war period, and I would probably the entire 20th century as a whole, because of the wheels of Western colonialism getting, driving more and more and more, they needed to push these ideologies of white supremacy more and more and more. Number one, like I said, first amongst their own people to convince them of their own superiority, but then as a kind of a wedge and a weapon against the people that they were seeking to conquer, in order as a sort of psychological warfare to try to get these people to believe that they're inferior, right? But these sorts of situations always have their own dynamics. And what this sort of white supremacist ideology of Western elites has done is it has spawned its own reaction. So the entire narrative of Islamism, whether we believe Osama bin Laden and these terrorists went through the Twin Towers and hijacked it, or whatever we believe, or whether they did or didn't perpetrate, or whether ISIS is a controlled group or isn't a controlled group. The fact is that the reaction that these people embody is very much a reaction that stems from these false narratives that Western elites have been pushing for the last 200 years. That, by definition, have also shortchanged their own people everywhere, not just, they've shortchanged the common man in Europe. They've shortchanged the white working classes. They've shortchanged all of these people. Yet we have people today online who dominate the noosphere of YouTube and the internet in general, pushing these sorts of narratives very vigorously. This division, that we are the West is the best and the white is the greatest, and all, and on these stories go. When the truth of the matter is something else, and they're doing this for a very simple reason, because they see, like I said, there's a mobility of people of color who are coming up, who know how to call a spade a spade, and we look at their white brothers and sisters as equals rather than as masters. And this is an affront to these people. This is a problem for these people, because then that means that they cannot control their own people. That means that ultimately they cannot control their own resources and their own power. So this is a power game. This is what this is all about. And so the occult being the place that is as close to the spirit as one can possibly get, these elites have always understood that when you control the narrative of the occult, you control a lot of things about the people that come to it. So if you are pushing a white supremacist occultism, right, that becomes your weaponry in a sense. And so that now it is the responsibility of people like us who are versed in this world ourselves, to counter this. And yes, admit very point blank that we are engaged in an occult war against these forces. Just like Julius Evola, one of their heroes, mentioned in his book, Ride the Tiger. So yeah, we know what this is all about. But your average white Anglo-European also needs to understand that this is not a matter of hate. This is not a matter of us wanting to dominate them. I don't want to dominate anybody. This is about parity. This is about the realization that we are human just like you are, right? And we love you at the end of the day. We don't want to be your enemy. We want, you are our brothers or sisters. We want to walk hand in hand with you, shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart, to recreate this world, to make a better world for your children and our children, for your posterity and our posterity. We are not against you. Your attitudes and these false ideologies that, that your elites keep drilling into you, yeah, we're against that 100%. And the people who articulated 100% we're against that. But you as people, we're not against you. We are one. We are one and the same. There's no difference between you and I. And I know that because, my wife was white, my late wife. I have loved the white woman, and like I mentioned in one of our previous podcasts, a lot of this problem seems to be concentrated within the white male in this time, more than the white female. I mean, I'm not saying that there are no such thing as female white racists. There is. But by and large, the white woman is a much more switched on, much more sensitive, and much more together creature that understands various things more than the white male is. The white male is just somewhere else most of the time, right? So we're even calling to those sisters to help us. Help us. The problem with the white male. Help us. To knock some sense into this guy, because we're not after him. We're not trying to kill him. We don't want to take anything away from him, right? All we're saying is, number one, stop taking away from us. Let's live together, right? Let's build this better world together as a single species under one God. Enough of this nonsense. Enough of this white supremacy and the ideology talk. This is a mind virus. This is like coronavirus. Worse, worse than any pandemic that you can imagine. This is a virus of the mind. You are diseased. And we want to help you get over it because we want to make you better than what you are. We don't want to bring you down. We don't want to destroy your world. We want to give you the best. You deserve the best. Be with us, hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart. Let's recreate this world together.
Yes, and I couldn't have said it any better than myself, the way that Sheikh Wahid Azal describes this whole scenario and situation. And it's so interesting. I live in Philadelphia, and there's a community here, the Baba Muhyiddin Fellowship. And there were American white Jews who brought Bawa from Sri Lanka here. And so we're not condemning the white people. We're stating these truths that need to be shared. And even to this day, their descendants are taking care of Bawa's fellowship. And you go there, everyone's welcome, whether you're white, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Black. They have somebody from each part of the community that's serving in the leadership in some way. And they are in a perfect example that if they can do that and serve the community and the fellowship, whether you're a Sufi or not, then all of us have that capability as well to do so, to serve a world that where all of God's creation is equal, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam all teach us to become one ummah. Even in the Masonic Brotherhood, they teach you on the level. No one is above you or beneath you. So we need to work towards that society, and the true origins of these different esoteric paths, no matter what you're an initiate of. And what Sheikh Wahid Azal said cannot be stressed enough. And please take heed that we're not here against anybody. We're standing for the truth. And those that don't like our truths, those are agents of chaos, and they also come in all races, religions, countries, and groups of the world. This internal fight between light and darkness that happens everywhere. It's not just an American thing or a Western thing. I've seen it everywhere. So let's stand on the right side of history and know what God has promised all of us, that good is always destined to win over evil. No matter what they try, no matter how powerful they are, good always wins. It's just the way the game works. So our beloved Sheikh, anything else that you would like to address on this topic?
I want to now address the other side, the phenomenon of Black and brown nationalism, which is also a flourishing one. It's feeding off of this whole white nationalism. This is also a path that leads down an abyss, right? Mm-hmm. One of the greatest example of someone who evolved and came out of that and became a shaheed was Haj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X. Yes. Malcolm X came out of the Nation of Islam. But, when he had his falling out with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, and he then went to the Hajj, he saw with himself that at the Hajj, and this was a great period. This is when the Saudis were still not that crazy as they are today. He saw with his own eyes that the entire diversity of humanity right before his eyes, all submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And then when he prays, especially when you have that scene in the movie Spike Lee made with Denzel Washington playing the lead role, when at the Grand Mosque, Malcolm X finally does his prayers, and he is truly then submitted to the All High. That entire narrative of the Black nationalism as a racialized ideology melts away. But simultaneously, he kept the good that he learned from the Nation of Islam, right? The fight for justice and economic and racial justice and equality for the people, and not compromising with the man. That we're not going to compromise with the man either. But what we got to do is that we have to get rid of these toxic narratives. This planet is in an emergency situation. And it doesn't matter how many times you try to assert your supremacy, either as a Black nationalist or a white nationalist. When this ecological doomsday unfolds, it is going to get you and the other guy equally. It won't matter to whether you're Black or white or yellow or green or red or pink or multicolored. It's going to come after all of us. So we have a responsibility towards each other, Black, white, yellow, red, pink, multicolored, to ensure that this extinction event doesn't occur. That we don't leave a world here for our children where there is a use-by date for it, that they won't have a future at all, or that they end up in some kind of a technocratic or technological dystopia where the environment is completely destroyed, but they are controlled by machines. Something that even the Wachowski brothers couldn't have conceived. We
Yes,
want to also prevent that from happening as well,
of
because that
course.
one, because if that comes, that will take all of us. It won't make any discrimination between white or black or whatever.
Well, see, to point out what you said in a very good way, and to just add on to that beautiful articulation that you did, is the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has said that a white is not superior over a black is not superior over a white, or an Arab or a non-Arab, and vice versa, except by piety and good action. And that's what changed Malcolm X's heart. And when he came back, he knew that these people were teaching him hate and division. I even see it here in the black and brown communities. You have these people that claim to be Moors and indigenous and Native Americans. They set up these so-called tribal governments, and they're charging these people that come up to them like $1,000 a package or $3,000 per sovereignty package. And they make all these documents. And when they go to the court, go in front of a judge, none of that stuff works. So they get in trouble, they get ripped off, and you have these vultures within their own community targeting their own community. So that's what we're saying, is that these agents of chaos they're everywhere. And some of them leech off and drink the blood of their own people. Like I see with many of these people, not saying all of them, but I have seen where the spiritual leaders, so-called, or tribal government leaders, so-called, are either using their followers for sexual purposes or financial purposes. So this is the reason why this world is suffering. And these next 9 to 10 years, you have natural disasters, wars, lack of resources, because Allah is not happy with us. We need to turn this thing around with the time that we have. I hope in my lifetime, I can see that happen, inshallah, if Allah gives me the enough life to witness something like that where I see unity and peace. But until then, I got to keep striving for it and support those who are supporting that truth and have been suppressed and attacked by the enemy, like Sheikh Wahid Azal. As you can see, with all of the talks that we did, it has knocked the teeth out of the enemy's mouth. And we're going to continue to knock their teeth out in a peaceful, lawful, legal, and educational manner, like we're continuing to doing. The element of free speech and free expression, the right of every human being. So please, Sheikh, continue.
What can I say? I mean, you just put it in a nutshell. That is what needs to be done. And I appeal to those of our brothers and sisters everywhere, not just in any single community, who listen to these words and either feel inspired or something clicks with them that perhaps we should do something together. I invite them, contact me, contact Salman Sheikh. Let's work together. Let's do something, because these divisions, just remember, these separatist ideologies that want to create ethno states and separate white people from black and brown people, etc. All of this serves one entity, and that is the system itself, for self-perpetuation. You are not going to change that system with that kind of separatism, ever, right? And the system knows that, and this is why it keeps on churning out these things, churning out the ethno-nationalism, or the black nationalism, or the Hindutva in India, or all kinds of permutations of this sort of thing. Because as long as we are divided, we cannot confront the system itself. We cannot confront the man. The folks back in the 60s understood this very well, and they came this close to dislodging that entire system. But because they were immature and naive in certain things, the system got the upper hand. But we are moving now to a time where we have learned a lot of things from the 1960s, and we are a different people than the folks back in the 1960s, and we need to create or recreate a movement, if not identical to it, but similar to it, to stop this system from killing all of us.
Yes, and it's very important you address that. And what is it that killed their movement? Because I had a professor, and he made us read this book called The Portable 60s Reader. And in that book, I think they have a PDF of it online too. And they have these different collections of Abby Hoffman and all of these different people that did their social justice activism. And what I was able to pick up from those teachings and, that required course material we had to read, was that a lot of these movements got taken down because they got infiltrated by the agents of chaos who were posing as one of their own, that I'm here as on your side, etc. So they were infiltrated by the agents and handlers that came in and kind of sabotaged them. But had they knew and had that discretion, we might have been living in a totally different America or the world today. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always has a plan. And it says in the Holy Quran that they plot and plan, but Allah is also the best of all planners. And that is the ultimate
Makaru,
truth.
makaru wa makaru Allah wallahu khairul makirin. Absolutely. Yes.
Yes, yes. So anything else, Sheikh, you would like to share about this topic?
No, I think we pretty much covered most of the ground. I'm happy with what we've talked about so far.
Thank you. So with that, everyone, I would like to conclude this podcast with the greetings of Assalamu alaikum and Nur alaikum to our beloved Sheikh. Thank you. And I will put his links in the description below as always. Please pray for him, his family, and all of us that are in this struggle. We're all in this together, and let's try to fight for a great world together. Thank you.